Good morning, everyone, and today I'd like to talk about one of the biggest crime events in the 21st century, entitled 9/11, which is a major story in your CSI book. 9/11 actually stands for September 11, 2001. So, what was this story about? By the time you're actually watching this, you probably have read the story already, the series of events in the book, the CSI book. Basically, it was an attack, or rather a series of attacks on America's financial and political institutions on the East Coast of America. And four planes or four flights were involved. There was Flight American Airlines 11, which took off from Boston Logan's Airport. United Airlines Flight 175, which also took off from Logan Airport in Boston a bit later at 8:14 a.m. The earlier one took off at 7:59 a.m. on that day. There was American Airlines Flight 77, which left Washington, as in Washington, D.C., Dulles International Airport at 8:20 a.m. And there was United Airlines Flight 93, which left Newark International Airport. Now, Newark is not to be confused with New York, although it is very closely located to New York City. Newark is in the state of New Jersey, right next to New York, as in New York City. And a lot of people who work in New York actually live in Newark and New Jersey. Today I'm going to basically just concentrate on the two flights, the two iconic flights that flew into the World Trade Center, the North Tower, WTC-1, and the South Tower, WTC-2. These two are considered highly iconic, and when we think of September 11th to this very day, we think of what happened to the Twin Towers in New York City. So this is what I'm going to actually be concentrating on today. Now, what I have here are the flight paths or the flight trajectories of the four flights, and you can see how United Airlines Flight 175 and also American Airlines Flight 11 took off in the direction of New York City, headed towards the Twin Towers. And here, in this diagram, you can see how they flew into WTC-1, the North Tower, and WTC-2, respectively. You have a top-down view and you have a side view, and it basically details the direction in which they flew and subsequently what happened when they flew into these two buildings, okay, and the parts of the fuselage and landing gear which fell immediately after they flew into these two buildings. I think what's interesting is the background of the 4 or 5 people who were involved in these crashes. And so I'm going to focus on this because I assume that you have already read the story, but you may not know too much at this point about the background of the terrorists, the perpetrators, right? So all 4 of them were from the Middle East. We have Khalid al-Mihdhar, who was Saudi Arabian. He was born in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, which is considered the holiest of the holiest cities for Muslims. And ironically, he came from a prominent family, okay, a rather rich family, related to a prominent tribe in the city of Mecca. Then there is Nawaf al-Hazmi, who was born the son of a grocer. He was born in Mecca as well, in Saudi Arabia, and he, as a teenager, traveled to Afghanistan. There's Muhammad Atta, who was Egyptian. Now, this is the interesting thing about Muhammad Atta's background. He was born into a pretty well-educated and pretty well-to-do family. His father was a lawyer, and they became wealthy through farming and trading, so definitely not poor. Marwan al-Shehi was from the UAE, where Dubai is located. So he's not Egyptian. He is not from Saudi Arabia. He's from the UAE. Quite often we think of the Middle East as one country with one people, but actually they're not. So he was from the UAE. He subsequently moved to Germany to study. He became a student there. And that is where he actually met Muhammad Atta, the Egyptian. And there's one more person involved. There is Ziad Jarrah, who is Lebanese, and he was a member of Al-Qaeda, and he was one of the major perpetrators of the September 11 attacks, and he was on United Airlines Flight 93. Now, Jarrah was Lebanese. He was born in Beirut, which is considered a pretty forward-looking city, a very open-minded city, and he was from a very wealthy family, okay, even though he was Muslim. So these are the characters involved, the terrorists involved. One thing that is for sure is they don't exactly come from poor or uneducated families. In fact, some of them are very rich. I guess the question is why? Why would fairly well-to-do people actually be driven to commit such acts of terrorism? And the question beckons, why do conflicts happen? And what kind of people become radicalized and turn into terrorists, right? And so these are things for you to think about, and you can basically reflect on one of the anthology pieces that you've read on radicalization. I'm going to actually skip this part a bit, but I'm just going to have you reflect on it a bit. Of the 4 air disaster incidents that took place, which incidents has left the deepest impression on you? And I believe I answered that earlier. The Twin Tower attacks, although 9/11 was not just about the Twin Towers. Now, a bit of background about the Middle East. Okay, as I said previously, the Middle East is not just one country. And indeed, it's not just about one people. Although the majority are Muslims, there are actually a lot of other religions and a lot of other sects. In fact, there are a lot of Christians and there are Jews, especially in Israel, the Jewish state. And so you need to probably understand why there is this conflict in the Middle East that eventually spills over into acts of terrorism in other countries. Well, first of all, we have to look at what the Middle East is about besides religion, right? And history. The Middle East, much of it is about oil, basically. And Saudi Arabia is the biggest producer of oil, especially cheap oil, followed by Iraq and the UAE. So this is something you have to be aware about. So there is interest involved. And the main driver of oil money in terms of a currency driver is the US dollar. So if you can see the connection there, all right? So the countries that you see here highlighted in yellow, orange, are major oil producing countries. And of course, America and Venezuela and Mexico on the other side of the ocean also produce oil. Then there's the religious and the ethnic side of it. I guess we have to start from World War II. The majority of Jews back at that time actually lived in Europe. There were more than 6 to 7 million Jews living throughout Europe, especially in Central Europe and in Germany. And so what happened in Europe was that the Nazis took over and they instituted something called the Last Solution, which was an act of rounding up as many Jews as possible and sending them to concentration camps and basically killing them and exterminating them. So this is what happened in Nazi Germany. In fact, this is what happened throughout Europe, Nazi Europe, or parts of Europe that came under German rule, Nazi rule. In fact, about 6 million Jews were exterminated in concentration camps, So the result was that the elimination of Nazi Germany, the Allies won, and the relocation of the so-called Jewish nation back to a newly formed state called Israel. But the thing here is that there were already people living in what is today Israel. Okay, there were Palestinians, most of whom were and still are Christians and Arabs. And so this was a United Nations sponsored and state sponsored, as in United States and United Kingdom sponsored project. And it basically was to remigrate Jewish people back to their forgotten homeland, right, so to speak. And so this basically gave rise to tensions between two groups of people, right? As you can see from this map, Israel grew and grew and grew, and the original Palestinian territories at the same time shrunk, right? And so most Palestinians now are located outside of Palestine, the West Bank, and the rest are in the green areas on your right, the West Bank. So that's one issue here, okay? And as recently as a few years ago, Donald Trump, or the Donald Trump government in the United States, decided to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv, which is highly secular, not very religious, in Israel, to a highly religious city called Jerusalem. And that sparked off a series of events, as you can see from here, right? That sparked off a series of events here. And there were protests. Of course, a lot of Palestinians and Muslims were not happy. I mentioned something about the Palestinians, actually, earlier. A lot of them were driven away from their original homeland. So this so-called original homeland was a shared piece of territory, but a lot of them were driven away, or they chose to leave. They chose to move into nearby territories. Lebanon was one of them. And so what happened was this conflict spread, okay, from within Israel to beyond Israel, because Palestinians in other countries like Lebanon were considered to have been attacking Israel from the outside, and so the Israelis launched attacks in their these nearby countries as well. And so one after another, things happened, and that caused conflict in the next door neighbor, Lebanon, and very soon there was an internal civil war, and the capital Beirut split between east and west. So that was Beirut, Lebanon, before the war, before the civil war, what it is today. And so to cut a long story short, I want to end this lesson with one of America's most famous foreign secretaries quote, Henry Kissinger. And he said, once upon a time, America has no permanent friends or enemies and only interests. So back to 9/11, a lot of Muslims actually felt that they were bullied for many, many decades by Israeli interests and by American interests. And there was a feeling of wanting to get back and wanting to teach America a lesson. And that ultimately resulted in 9/11. All right. And so going back to this phrase, America has no permanent friends or enemies, but only interests, I want you to take this and reflect on whether or not this is true at school or at the workplace or in the world at large. And that is it for today on 9/11.